Welcome to Robert Sungenis Live. As you know, we come to you every week on Wednesday from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. This is the program that is set aside for you to ask your questions, give your comments on any topic whatsoever. And I, as my role as host of this program, will endeavor to answer your questions to the best of my ability using our Catholic faith, Scripture, the tradition, the popes, the councils, the doctors, the saints, the catechisms, and just about anything I can find to help you walk away satisfied that your question has indeed been answered. At the top of the program, sometimes I usually have some topic that I'd like to cover, but I'm going to forego that today, although there's a lot going on in the Catholic Church today that needs to be talked about. Because we have a special guest coming on at 4 p.m., 1 hour from now, by the name of the good Michael Voris, who runs the operation, the ministry, the apostolate in Detroit, Michigan, called the Church Militant. And as you know, Michael's been around for a while doing his job, and so we're going to try to get into his brain today to see if we can even see more than what he actually says on his programs. Maybe we'll get some inside tips, some pointers on how to cover the news and how he finds all his information, because he sure does have a plethora of information for us. And unfortunately, most of it's negative. And that's what makes him unique, because he's one of the only ones who has the courage, the guts, and the brains to go find out this information for us. And I'm glad he's on the air, and I ask you to pray for him and his ministry, that they survive and that the devil doesn't get in the door and mess things up as he usually does, because there's a lot of mess going on today that needs to be rectified, if it's even rectifiable. And that's one of the questions I'm going to put to Michael today, as a matter of fact. Is it possible to turn this around? Because if you examine history, and when it gets to this stage is probably not descriptive of actually what's going on, but this stage is, I think, the highest, the most apostate, the most evil that it has ever confronted the Catholic Church in its 2,000 years. And I know that's a pretty serious statement, but I do know Catholic history, and I do know what I see in front of me. And Michael sees the same thing, and that's why I wanted to bring him on. So he will be here at 4 if everything goes well. My producer, John, hasn't come yet, so I am a little worried, because I don't know how to press any of the buttons. And but anyway, Michael will be joining us at 4. So there is a couple of questions that people have sent in by email, and I will get to them right now, get them out of the way, and then we'll go to the board here and see what is on your mind. All right. Question number 1. Hi, Robert. I came across this video on Michael Lofton's channel from a year or so ago. The guy that he has on goes by the moniker River Run. Well, that's certainly an interesting name. Anyways, I thought I'd send it your way, since the question of evolution is raised and the church's position on it. From the 50-minute mark, someone sends a question about evolution, and River Runs responds on what is not condemned by the church regarding evolution. He basically states that evolution is not condemned per se, but rather that dogmas don't express objective truths and can't be authoritatively stated in a definitive way once and for all by the magisterium of the church. Okay, so that's the first question. I looked at that video just, for a little bit. I thought he was saying just the opposite. Now, this is written in by Michael, And I thought he was saying that it is true, um, that once the church makes a dogma, that it was condemned by the Pope, that someone could come in and say, well, this dogma that was, written, 100 years ago or so needs to be adjusted to the situation we have today. Now, unless I listened wrong, and that's always possible, but I thought he was agreeing that you can't do that. I don't know exactly how much that has to do with evolution, okay? Because um, in his and he seemed to be a pretty smart guy, so he was definitely no slouch. He seemed to know his facts pretty well. Um, but sometimes, evolution becomes more of an opinion because the church probably hasn't been as definitive on it as it should be. And it drew its line in the sand as late as 1950 in Pius XII's encyclical Humani Generis, where he basically said, look, we'll go let you study all the scientific facts or theories or suppositions or whatever about evolution. And really, the Pope can't say anything to stop us from doing that, I mean, because it's a scientific theory. So he's going to allow you to go study what they think are facts or theories or whatever. So that's only natural that he would allow that. But when you read Humani Generis, and it's not that long, a couple of pages, I think it's got 16 statements he makes. He basically draws the line in the sand by saying, okay, so you go study all this stuff about evolution. You see all the proponents of it saying, oh, yeah, well, it has to be this way, because we've understood the DNA molecule and, how everything's put together and blah, blah, blah. And they give all their arguments. He says, look, here's the bottom line. The bottom line is if you can show that there is no Polygenism in the theory of evolution. Now, Polygenism needs to be defined, of course, and that is poly means many, okay? Genism is, beginning. So basically, the theory of evolution maintains that as apes evolved into man, and I even hate saying that because it just seems so weird, doesn't it? I mean, that my ancestors were apes. God. But he says, if you can find a mechanism, scientific mechanism, that should, also be based in theology, that allows one of those apes to be infused with a human soul at the time he is transitioning from his hominid state to the Homo sapien state, wherever and whenever that occurs. If you can prove that he was the only one that evolved into man and that God then infused a soul into him, okay, well, then you've passed, you've checked off that box. And when we can pay more attention to you, okay? That doesn't mean you proved evolution, okay? It just means that you've crossed the hurdle that the Catholic Church has given you, which is, look, there was only one man who was infused with a soul, and there was only one man that became a man from all the apes that were still evolving, okay? That's a pretty hard task to fill because the way evolution sees it is that there were thousands, perhaps millions of apes that were evolving into men. They sure don't believe that there was just one ape that evolved into a man and then God infused a soul into him. Okay. But that's what the Catholic would have to find in the history, in the theory, somewhere where you can make it convincing that there was only one ape that evolved into one man that was infused with the human soul. Okay. And that's where the line is drawn. And let me tell you, that is basically impossible for any Catholic theistic evolutionist to solve that puzzle. Okay. I have heard like 2 or 3, maybe 4 theories on how that might be possible, but they are so ridiculously theoretical and speculative that one wonders, what do they do all night? Sit up and dream how these things could possibly take place? And that's pretty much what they do. Um, so with that line in the sand drawn, it really, you really don't have to go back into the history of the church and find a specific statement where they condemn evolution. Okay. Now, in many ways, the church has come down on the theory of evolution, especially Pius X in his encyclicals. You know, everything goes to evolution, he says. Once they find this scientific paradigm that they think men were evolved from apes, then everything becomes based on evolution. You see, evolution of education, evolution of the church, evolution of this and that. And, you basically get tired. They found one thing that they could hook all their ideas on, which is evolution. This is what Teilhard de Chardin did. He and interestingly enough, if you read Teilhard's writings on this, he says, once we got rid of geocentrism, everything was open and evolution came. And now we can hang our hats and base every theological dogma, every belief, every idea on the idea of evolution, which he then developed into, at some point, man, he would evolve to the point where he would reach the omega point. And the way we get there is by this noosphere of ideas that are constantly coming down and progressing man's evolution. I mean, it's like watching a science fiction program. De Chardin just made it up as he went along, but everything was based on evolution, you see. And what was it, Pius XII, condemned his writings, and then the liberals from the post-Vatican II era picked them all up again. And so he's still being taught in the schools, among other, deleterious things. But so, the strongest statements that the church ever made were like from Lateran IV and Vatican I, that intimated, at least, that evolution was not the way to go, because they make statements where it says, everything that we see that was made by God ex nihilo, and it just doesn't give any room. It says all things were made by God. So it just doesn't give any room. You have to read into the passage something where you can see some room for evolution, but basically there's just nothing there. Okay. So those are some of the strongest statements we had. And Vatican I even added to Lateran Council IV's statement where it said that God made things in their whole substance, in their whole being, which to me, even though it might be talking against pantheism in the philosophical sense, yeah, I understand all that, but still, the raw meaning of that phrase at Vatican I, which was God made everything in its whole substance, again, flies right in the face of evolution, because evolution doesn't believe that. It believes everything was pieced together by slow, tedious mechanisms like genetic mutation and over millions of years. So it's not saying that it believes everything was made in its whole substance. And we've had some good authors against evolution, like Behe, Darwin's Black Box, where he writes his book, one of the best books written against evolution. And this guy knows what he's talking about because he took all the secular courses and he's got his PhD in some hard science. And he says, look, you can't get around this idea of irreducible complexity. And I often use the example of a mousetrap. You know, a mousetrap has basically 5 parts, and those parts are all needed in order to make the mousetrap work. If you're missing one part, forget about it. It ain't going to work. So, and then when you're putting the mousetrap together, you have to put it together in sequence, proper sequence. If you don't, then you're not going to be able to put it together because some part's going to get in the way of the one that should be there. Okay, so everything we see, everything we know is it's something built in sequence and in a very short time, and so that all the parts can work together, and voila, we have, you know, trees, plants, human beings, animals, everything. Because the only way it could work is if all the parts are there to work together. Okay, so I've seen how these evolutionists try to get around that by going to the basal cells and say, well, you know, this happened and that happened. But, you know, we don't see any of that in daily life. Okay. We all know intuitively that unless all the parts of my body are there, it ain't going to work. Okay. I have to have my heart, my brain, my lungs, all at the same time, or it's not going to work. Okay. So common sense tells us a lot about this so-called theory of evolution. Look, the guys that invented this were not Christian. They didn't believe in God. Yet they knew they were scientists, and scientists have to explain everything scientifically. So science doesn't believe in the miracle of having all the parts together at once, because that is a miracle. And they don't believe in miracles. So they are forced to find some other way. And I mean forced. Otherwise, they're going to have to bow the knee to God. And that means that they're going to be accountable for all their sins. And they know this intuitively. And so the only way that they can clear the guilt of those sins is by pretending that there's some other mechanism that brought all this together. And they know it's impossible, but they keep teaching it because that's all they have. They have to keep pretending that it's possible. There's a guy, Richard Lewontin from Harvard, geneticist, evolutionist from Harvard, just died a few years ago. He said, look, we know our theories don't work. We know it from the start. But you have to know this about us. We're committed to materialism. What's materialism? That there ain't a God. That everything happens naturally. From some long distant age, it progressed and we've got it now, and it's been running that way ever since. That's materialism. You just knock out the spiritual. No spiritualism at all. That means no miracles, no nothing. Okay. So he says, so we're forced by our materialism not to let, quote, a divine foot in the door, unquote. Okay. So he's admitted that their mechanisms don't work. Like, you try to prove evolution by genetic mutation, good luck. Because 99% of genetic mutations are harmful. They're not in an upward progression. They're harmful. and they occur by accident. Okay? So, but even Pius XII, as I said, he said, look, you can go, we're not going to stop you. You can go investigate this all you want. And if you come up with something that works, fine, we'll listen to you. But here's the thing. If you even find the mechanism of how it all works, the theology says there was only one ape that could become a man because only one man received an infused soul from God, not thousands of men at the same time, who evolved from apes and these thousands became men. And then God infused a soul into those 1,000 or million or billion, whatever it was. You can't go that way. Only one. Why? Well, because we have this pesky little doctrine called original sin. An original sin came from one man named Adam. We even know his name. And it says, because of Adam's sin, the whole world is plunged into sin and death. Romans chapter 5, verse 12. And because of that, a second Adam had to come to redeem the whole human race. Okay? So that's a fact. That's a theological fact. Can't get around it. And so that's why you find a lot of theistic evolutionists come to the point where they either don't listen to the church when the church says you can't have Polygenism, or they start denying original sin. Okay. And in denying original sin, what you're saying basically is man is today the way he always was. There was no Garden of Eden where he was tempted by the devil. He just is. In other words, whoever created him the way he is now. That's the way he was created. In other words, he was created with evil. Okay. And there's a famous Protestant theologian named Karl Barth, Barth, who is a liberal Protestant theologian. And around the 1950s or so, he came up with this solution to the problem. Oh, and everybody was so happy. Yeah, that's the problem. Original sin's in the way. Okay. And so everybody started believing, well, maybe that doctrine needs to go to make room for evolution, you see. Because that's the doctrine, if you look at it closely, is saying that we can't have Polygenism. Okay. Because original sin only applies to one man, Adam. So whatever the church has said before or after, this statement by Pius XII, unless you can deal with this issue of Polygenism, don't bother telling us that evolution is the way things happened. Okay? This is basically what he said in Humani Generis 1950. I don't know of one person who's even come close to explaining how you can believe in evolution and not believe in Polygenism. Okay? So they're at rest. He laid it at their door. You can figure this out. You can believe in evolution. Until then, don't be going around telling people that we evolved from apes, is what he also said. Okay? So there's our safeguard right there. All right, let me go on to the next question. Oh, where are we here? Another reference to Michael Lofton. He did a video defending the infallibility of canonizations, your favorite recent popes. He quotes saints who suggested that denying it is, quote, at least next door to heresy, and goes on to substantiate that claim on the basis of denying secondary objects of infallibility. Here's a link, and so I went and I looked at this, and Michael Lofton did what everybody else does, who's trying to support the idea that canonizations are infallible. And I don't think he succeeded. Okay, I mean, the one thing I keep harping on is Canon Law 749 says, no doctrine is understood as infallible unless this is manifestly evident, period. Okay, that's Canon 749, paragraph 3. So that says a lot, because it doesn't leave room for us to say, gee, was that infallible or not? Because if it wasn't manifestly evident, there would be no argument between us. We would say, oh yeah, that's infallible. Look at the wording. It's infallible language. But as I said last time we dealt with this, which was probably last week, that's not what the church has done. Okay? The church doesn't come out with a doctrine to say, by the way, at the end of the doctrine, this is an infallible and irreformable statement by the Catholic Church, which means it can't be changed, that it is perfect the way it is, and you are required to obey it. For some odd reason, that language isn't there. And so we struggle to understand what is infallible, what is not, even without the canonization issue. Okay? And I gave the example of the 1994 encyclical or letter by John Paul II, which barred women from the priesthood. And everybody's looking at this and saying, well, is this infallible? And they kept asking the question, and the Vatican just kept on stalling. Finally, Ratzinger came out as prefect of the congregation for the doctrine of the faith and said, yes, it's infallible. But that didn't come from the Pope. That came from the prefect. And he's not infallible. Okay? So, in order to fulfill what Canon 749 is saying, that it's not infallible unless it's manifestly so, it's going to take a lot more work, a lot more verbiage to guarantee that this is infallible. For the people's sake, for Pete's sake. It's not hard. All you got to do is write the proper sentence, and nobody will have a question. If it says this is infallible, what's to argue about? Okay? So the church can make it a lot easier on itself if it would just take the extra 5 seconds to write that sentence. Okay? So if that's the case, or since that's the case, and since the church has not made any infallible declaration that canonizations are infallible, then it's not manifestly evident, is it? The very fact that we're arguing about it means it's not manifestly evident. And it has to be according to canon law in order for us to accept it as infallible. Okay, so it doesn't matter what saint you quote. And he's quoting St. Alphonsus Liguori, and he had his good points and bad points. And Suarez and Bellarmine, as much as I like Robert Bellarmine, he overstepped his bounds on occasion. Okay? Like when they were talking about whether they could depose a pope if the pope became, apostate in their view. And you got all these guys giving opinions on whether they can depose a pope. And some said yes, some said no, and some said in between. What does that tell you? Well, that tells you nobody knows what the answer is. Why is that? Well, because there's been no pope or council that has been headed by a pope that has defined or taught that a pope can be deposed. Plain and simple. So why these guys are talking about it in the Middle Ages, because no pope before them had ever defined it. Okay? So the closest they got, I think, was Honorius, but he wasn't deposed. He was called a heretic, but they never said, well, he wasn't really a pope to begin with. Nobody said that. Okay? So it doesn't matter who you quote. You can give me 2 dozen quotes that all say the same thing, and it doesn't amount to a hill of beans. All it is a pious opinion. Granted, these men were saints and theologians and all this stuff, but look, the smartest of them still can't figure it out. That's why we need help from on high. And if God wanted to give it to us, well, maybe we can say he would have given it to us, but he hasn't. Okay? So no one can make the proclamation that canonizations are infallible unless you can find a statement from the church that's clearly manifest an infallible statement. Okay? So, and then somebody else said, well, that means that, somebody may be praying to somebody that was canonized, but he's in hell. Yeah, well, maybe that's the case. Who knows? That's a supposition. That's a theory. Can you prove it? You can't go that. So you can't go in that direction either and make up a hypothesis and then use that hypothesis as proof that canonizations are infallible, because there may be some negative effects. Can't do that. I mean, just turn it around on the other side of the coin and ask, well, what happens um, when we're praying to someone that we believe because the church, because canonizations are infallible, and we've prayed to them, um, but they aren't truly saint. Okay, or let's put it this way. Maybe that wasn't as logical as I'd like it to be. Let's put it this way. If you think it's a scandal that you've prayed to someone for a favor that might be in hell, as odd as that might be, what greater scandal is there than praying to someone, a pope who's scandalous himself, Pope Francis, has canonized, that led a life that was not a saintly life, okay, like Paul VI, or even John Paul II. If you knew some of the things that John Paul II did, besides the obvious things like, these CC international or interreligious prayer meetings, where he invited all the pagans of the world to pray to their false gods right in the court of Rome so that we could have world peace. I mean, come on. And I'm not the only one. There were many people, and this is why his canonization was railroaded in, the shortest canonization we've had of any saint, because everybody had questions about this. Come on, man. He not only had the one Assisi in 1986, he had 5 more, and then the grand finale in 2002, where he did exactly the same thing. He let the pagans pray for world peace. And of course, they're praying to their false gods. So this is a breaking of the first commandment. Okay. On the sex scandal, homosexual pedophile sex scandal happened throughout the pontificate of John Paul II. And when it was brought to his attention, he just excused it. He gave the excuse that, well, that's what the Germans used to do. They used to accuse the priest of being homosexual so they could make the church look bad. And right under his nose, it was happening. And we found out in 2002, it just exploded in the press. And it's even exploding now. Okay. So how is it that this man is declared a saint by someone else who's not so saintly? That's Pope Francis. Okay. And yet they're still popes. So, talk about a scandal. Think of all the people that have been scandalized by that. So don't talk to me about, oh, it's a scandal if you pray to somebody and you find out later they might be in hell. Yeah, that's a scandal. Okay, but we got worse ones today with what I just said. Okay, so in any case, it's not going to prove anything. It's not going to prove that canonizations are infallible just because somebody might be scandalized. Look, there's enough scandal in the church to go around and around and around and around. The infallibility issue is the least of those that scandalizes. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, as a matter of fact, when Michael Voris comes on the show. So, all right. I think that was the last one. Yeah, that's the last one. Okay, so now we're going to go to the board here and see what you guys have to say and see if I can help you at all. All right, question from Antonio says, does modern science support a finite or infinite universe? It depends on who you talk to. Modern science, they used to believe in an infinite universe as far back as Isaac Newton. Okay, and the reason they thought it was infinite back then, or he suggested that it was infinite, was that this little thing called gravity. Because if you have all these celestial bodies out there and you know that each of them have gravity, well, if your universe is finite and these things aren't moving, so to speak, they're out there and they stay there, well, eventually they're going to feel the gravitational pull of the next object, the next star, and they're slowly going to come together, you see. Especially when you have as many stars out there as we do. There's this little thing called the Hill sphere, Hills sphere, which is the gravitational radius of a celestial body. The Earth has one, the Sun has one, and then if you think of all the stars, if there really is 6 sextillion stars out there, well, that's a lot of gravity. And you think if there's a Hill sphere of all those stars put together, well, eventually they're all going to come together in one big ball. Okay. And now here's the catch-22 to that, however. The only way to solve that problem is to have an infinite universe. Okay. So if the universe is infinite, what Newton said was that's the stars can spread out infinitely and they won't come together. Okay. So there's your problem. And then that developed into what they call the steady state theory. That is that the universe is infinite and it's always been here, because if something's infinite, that means it's always been here. There is no time when it started. So it has to be here for infinity, which is a hard concept for people to accept. And everybody knew there was something wrong with that, but they didn't know anything else. Okay. And then in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, they saw this redshift thing. And so Hubble developed this concept of we see the redshift because the universe is expanding. And then Lemaitre came along and said, if the universe is expanding, then there must have been a beginning point. And everybody go, oh, a beginning point. All right. So now you got the makings of a finite universe. Because if you have a beginning point, it's finite. Okay. And then they developed their Big Bang theory from this infinite point, and Lemaitre called it an egg or a seed to get the concept across. And there were people that disagreed with him, like Arthur Eddington said, no, that's not the way it would happen. He was just the opposite. So, but the Catholic Church, because Father Lemaitre was a Catholic priest, everybody got behind him. And even Pius XII was moved by this, said, should we write something about, the beginning of the universe by the Big Bang? And Lemaitre wasn't the one that called it the Big Bang. That came from Fred Hoyle, but in derision, because Fred Hoyle was a steady state theorist. That is the infinite universe theory. Okay. So, so now you have the makings of a finite universe, but of course the question's going to come up. Where did this little seed come from? Whatever you want to call it. Okay. Was there something there or not that started this bang? Now, you and I know that something can't come from nothing. So it's got to be something. And then, of course, you have to explain, well, why did it all of a sudden decide to explode? What's the mechanism? What's the scientific mechanism? Now, here they go, blah, 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 well, our physics just doesn't go back that far. Well, of course it doesn't, because your own physics knows it's absurd. Okay? So then the idea came about, 15, 20 years ago or more, that, that must mean that our little seed, whatever it was, came from another universe. And then that universe had to come from another universe. And we call this the multiverse. And what's the multiverse? It's an infinite number of universes. So, all they've done is move the problem back one step. You see, they pretended they got out of it by inventing the multiverse, is where our little seed came from that exploded into our present universe. All right, well, how far back do you have to go? Well, you have to go back an infinite amount of time, because every universe is created by another universe. The mommy universe creates the baby universe. Okay, so you're right back to the steady state theory, although you've just added little increments here and there in infinity. Okay, so basically all of modern science knows that the solution to their problem is an infinite universe. Okay, but then, of course, an infinite universe, an infinite time, that is absurd as well. They know that. Okay, but what did we say? Well, what did they say? We said, like, I just quoted from you to you from Richard Lewontin from Harvard. He goes, look, we know our theories don't work, but we're materialists. So we go back and try to find material. Whether it's the seed of the Big Bang or the multiverse, whatever, that's our material. Because why? Because we can't let a divine foot in the door. Okay? So there you go. All right. Question, is there a way to incorporate temporal dynamics into the predestination plan, especially in light of God changing his mind? It depends on what you mean there. Temporal dynamics, I guess you're talking about man's free will. Okay. So what we do know is this. Okay. God's foreknowledge of what will happen is as ineffectual of changing anything as our foreknowledge or our knowledge of the past. Okay, we know all what happened in the past, right? But our knowledge of it's not going to change anything that happened in the past. This is what Augustine said, which is a pretty good way to grasp this. It's not perfect, but at least it's some kind of handle we can hold on to. God's foreknowledge of the future is as ineffectual of changing it as our knowledge of the past is ineffectual of changing the past. Okay, so what happens is we tend to think that God's foreknowledge is something that foresees an event happening, and then God's got to do something in order to stop it. If it's going to conform to God's will. That's not the way it happens. Okay. God knows what's going to happen because God's God. But his knowledge of that is not going to change. Like, for example, God's foreknowledge of how you use your free will is not going to change how you use your free will. Okay. He just knows it beforehand and afterward, of course, but it's not going to change how you use your free will. So your free will has a certain ontology in itself, not apart from God totally, but your free will then cannot be coerced by God. In other words, God can't put everything in order and then you're created and you have a free will, and then all that God created before you is more or less forcing you, not forcing or influencing you to make the decision with your free will. No, that's not the way it happens either. Okay. All that happened in the past doesn't matter a bit, because if it did and in any way influenced your free will to decide for good or evil, then it wouldn't be free will, would it? Okay. So we have to live at this time in the dichotomy that free will is just as important, powerful, valid as God's predestination. Okay. No one, and I mean no one, in all of church history, and I'm talking about some of our greatest saints and doctors, has been able to put that together. Okay. All we can say is, like the Catechism says, one of the most brilliant statements of the Catholic Catechism, paragraph 600. We have God's predestination plan, but in that predestination plan, man's free response is included. And that's as far as it goes. Because nobody dare try to say, oh, here's how it works. We can't do it. Okay. Can't do it. The last great argument we had on that was the Molinists against the Thomists, where we get the media essentia as the sort of buffer against the absolute predestination of Thomas. And they still didn't get anywhere, even dealing with that side issue, because that really didn't deal with free will as much as it did with the media essentia. That is the way that God had it all predestined that man with his free will could do such and such. Didn't deal with free will per se. Okay. So even dealing with that one angle, what's predestined, is can we say that somehow there's a buffer in the predestination so that man can legitimately have a free will? Or are you going to go with the Thomists who say, well, no, God has it all calculated out, cause and effect only, which he got from Aristotle, of course. Cause and effect can be a great theological, metaphysical tool, but sometimes it gets in the way. Okay, not to say the cause and effect itself is bad, but when we try to use that as the sort of cure-all to the predestination free will problem, we may be creating more problems than we realize. Okay, and this is exactly why Martin Luther was excommunicated from the church, because he says, look, how can there be a free will? If God's got it all predestined, how can there be a free will? So you have no free will. It's all been figured out ahead of time. Okay? And his book was called The Bondage of the Will. So Calvin, the same thing. Now, Thomas, I don't see much of a difference between Thomas's view and Luther's view. Okay? Because Thomas said basically the same thing. It's all been figured out ahead of time, and you're just basically acting out what was all figured out. Okay? So the church says no. That's why she even allowed the debate between the Molinists and the Thomists. If Thomas was right, there wouldn't be no debate. Okay? But there is a debate. And that's because nobody is ever going to figure it out. Okay? We just have to put our faith and trust in God that we have a free will and it does depend on our decision. Talk to Adam, see what happened to him. So this is the mystery of God that nobody's ever going to figure out. How is it that God's predestination, his foreknowledge, all this stuff does not say that he predestined people to hell? Okay? That's the question of the ages. And we're not going to find out until we talk face to face with God. We even have local councils in the Catholic Church, the Council of Valence, and what's the other one? Trullo, that said that men were predestined to hell. Go look it up. 800s. Local councils. Okay? So they were taking the extreme view. But you won't find that in any of the ecumenical councils. Okay? So there is a temptation for people to say, oh, what the heck? Why am I trying to figure this out? Let's just leave it all to God. And he figured it all out. And we're just acting out what he had already figured out. Okay? No. Can't do that. That's not Catholicism. That's fatalism. Okay? So you have to give as much free will to the, or what you call the temporal dynamics, as you do to the predestination, and you leave it there, period, end of story. Okay? All right. Got 7 minutes until I hope Michael Voris comes on. So I got time for maybe one or two more questions here. John says, did Jesus's human nature always know who he was? In other words, did baby Jesus' human nature know who he was and what his purpose was? I think the answer to that would be no. Okay. His divine nature surely knew who he was. Okay. But the human nature, if you're going to have a human nature, you're going to have a progression of your knowledge as you age. Okay. Which is, you know very little. All you know as an infant is you want your mother's milk and you're hungry and you want to go to sleep, and basically that's all you know. Now he's also divine, which means his divine nature knows everything. The problem is, how do we incorporate the human and the divine when questions like this come up? Okay, and we have a couple of examples. We have Jesus in Matthew 24 saying that he does not know the time of the end. Okay, well, that can only be coming from his human nature, not his divine nature, because his divine nature would have to know. And yet, of course, somebody's going to come along and say, well, you got that problem now where you're, separating the human from the divine. Okay, well, if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. Otherwise, we're going to call Jesus a liar. Because if Jesus knew when the end of time was, and then he said he didn't know, if he knew in his human nature when the end of time was, and he said in his whatever nature is speaking, I don't know the end, well, then he would be a liar. And we can't do that. Okay? So this mystery of how to combine the divine with the human in the one person of Jesus is always going to be there. Always going to be there. And that example is enough for us to say that as a baby, no. In his human baby nature, no, he didn't know who he was. And that didn't come until Jesus was educated and he read the Psalms and he read the Old Testament and the Spirit of God is working with him and he comes to this knowledge. Yes. And then by the time he's 12, he says, don't you know I should be about my Father's business? When Mary and Joseph find him in the temple. Okay, well, this guy, he now knows who he is. And that took a process. Okay. And when he was an infant, he couldn't even speak, much less know he was the Son of God. Okay, except in his divine nature. So again, just like we have with the predestination and the free will, how do you combine them to get a logical answer that everybody says, oh, yeah, that's how it works? We won't get there. Same with the human and divine nature of Jesus. We're just not going to get there. We know what the human does. We know what the divine does. How they work together is a total mystery. Okay? All right. So we got time for a little bit more. Will Michael Voris or some at Church Militant have a debate with Brother Peter Diamond about sedevacantist issue given the circumstances of the world and recent videos of CM debates? Okay. I'll ask him. Well, that's one thing I appreciate about Michael Voris is as much as he rails against the Pope and the bishops for their dastardly deeds, he is as straight as an arrow when it comes to who the Pope is and who's not the Pope. Okay. All right. I see Michael's getting in his studio now, and things must be working. So, so now that I have your question, I'll ask him. He's got 4 minutes. So, okay, let me see what else we can do here. Somebody says, how to interpret Ezekiel's temple vision. We need your commentary for the Old Testament as well. Yeah, well, that's going to come after I get done the New Testament commentary. I have to be very selective in what I choose to put in there because it's, first of all, I'm getting older and I'm getting tired and I don't have as much time. So I had to be very judicious about what I speak about in the commentary. The New Testament commentary, that took 20 years to write. So since the Old Testament is 3 times as long, you can imagine how long that's going to take. That'll take 60 years. Unfortunately, I probably only have about 15 or 20 left, if that, the Lord willing. So, but that would be one of the passages we would tackle. And you're talking about Ezekiel's vision in Ezekiel 40 to 48. So, and it talks about sacrifices there. But it does have a lot of allusions to the apocalypse. I went through that at one time and saw about 15 allusions to basically saying something very similar to what the apocalypse is saying. Okay, so that's one possible interpretation. The other possible interpretation is that since this was not hypothetical, but a possible blessing to Israel if they had remained faithful to God. But since they didn't, then this prophecy was never fulfilled. Okay, that's another possibility. Okay, so we could get into all that later, but let me see. I don't know how to patch him in here. Let me see if I just have to press this button. Hey, is that you? Uh-oh, can't hear him. Let me see. Unmute. Uh-oh, Michael.
I don't know if you can hear me or not. Can you hear me, Robert? Whoa, I feel like we're doing a TV commercial.
How are you, sir?
Doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Oh, man. Michael, it is an honor.
Nope, no honor. No honor. We're all just Catholics just trying to do what we can do, right?
That's right. Thank you for that. Okay, so I won't read this page of adulation I have for you then. Okay. All right. So
unless it mentions that I was at one time for a very brief moment the leprechaun at Notre Dame, and I got disqualified from it. If you want to say that, you can certainly throw that little tidbit in, because that is one of the greatest injustices or miscarriages of justice in the history of humanity. Not that I'm bearing a grudge 40 years later, but
So, are you saying you were the mascot?
for about 17 hours.
How about that?
Yeah.
Well, everybody always wants to know who the mascot is. You know, the guy underneath. Like here in Philadelphia, where I live, we have
At
the.
Notre Dame, you can see him. There's no mask or any.
Okay.
But you can
I
see his
thought.
face pretty clearly.
Okay.
So, but yeah, it turned out that after the competition was over, one of the faculty people was like, "Did you ever get measured?" And I'm like, "No." I said, "Well, there's a height maximum that you can be, and you can't be over 5'9". I was 5'9.25" and got kicked off.
Oh well, tragedies.
It's horrible.
I hope that prepared you for the future, because that's what we're going to talk about now.
Well, it let's just say it wet my whistle to correct every injustice that I ever encounter.
Good for you, buddy. Everybody's got to have a starting point.
Well, there you go.
Okay, so the Church Militant has been doing their thing now for how many years?
We are going into our 18th year.
Wow.
It used to be known at, well, we've had a few different names along the way. Websites have had a few different names along the way. We've been churchmilitant.com for, I'm not sure, 8, 9, 10 years or something now. We were, before that, we were churchmilitant.tv. And then before that, realcatholictv.com. That got under the skin of the Archbishop here in Detroit, because the word Catholic was in it. And yeah, give me a break.
I went through that here in Harrisburg. Yeah.
So, but it's all under the auspices of the apostolate, which from the very beginning until now has never changed, and that's St. Michael's Media.
Great.
Those are just the website addresses. So
okay. So I want to run down some of the things you do here and just give me a brief explanation for our viewers who have never seen you. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you here. I mean, you're so big out there now, man. Everybody knows about Michael Voris, but there's probably some people that don't. So I want to educate them as to what you do, because to me, you're one of the most important voices out there. I don't know anybody who has, you know what canonizations are?
Yes.
I don't know anybody.
I know what that means.
Okay. I don't know anybody who has the canonizations like you do, Michael. So in this day and age, you're a voice that is as precious as gold. So I'm right in line with you. What you're doing, how you do it, everything. So you have this program called the Vortex, where you spin the pencil every time. Do you ever get tired of doing that, spinning that pencil, or is it?
No, and that all just sort of began as a joke in the studio while we were goofing around, and like, I don't know, a few days beforehand or something. I said, because we used to have in the original versions of this like swirly background that's was like looking down.
Yeah. And the words came on the screen every so often.
Yeah, it was way back at the beginning. Yeah, it was cool at the time. It's kind of cringy looking at it now, but so let's make a vortex symbol with a pencil, and it just, I don't know, it's just how it was.
All right. So like the vortex is to capture lies and falsehoods and tell the people about them, and those lies and falsehoods are in our Catholic Church. And
correct.
You've been doing this for 8.
To say more clearly, in case somebody who has weak faith hears that, they're not in the church. They're being propagated by individuals in the church. The church can't lie, and it can't say falsehoods.
Great. Thank you for that clarification.
Just in case somebody out is like, hey, wait a minute. So let's just be very clear. The church is the indefectible bride of Christ and cannot say something wrong. However, lots of people who are supposed to be saying that can, and they do.
Right. Very good. Very important clarification. And that helps people because they can separate the false from the true, I guess you could say, in the church.
Sure.
Because, you get to the point sometimes where you hear all this stuff and you're going, is there any good in the church?
Yeah,
Well, yes,
exactly.
there's always good in the church because, as you say, it's indefectible. And
That's
that
right.
doctrine will always be there, no matter
Mhm.
who out there it is who wants to pervert it, you know?
That's correct.
Okay, so that's the vortex, and that lasts for like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that.
Yeah, it's usually
And-
about 6 or 7 minutes long, roughly, depending on what the topic is, and every one of those topics, practically, you could write a book about.
Oh, yeah,
But
yeah.
want to sort of sum them up, and kind of, and certainly in the Catholic world, and I think even to some degree in the secular world, long before people were out there doing shows and putting up videos with commentaries and stuff like that. Certainly in the Catholic world, we were doing it first. And I guess if the old saying is true, imitation is the greatest form of flattery, well, then I guess we've been flattered because that's like what tons of other people in the Catholic media world are doing now.
Yeah.
But we were the first ones out there to put out little snippets of stories and little snippets of things. We go so far back doing that it goes back to the days of YouTube, when YouTube could only handle a file that was no longer than 10 minutes and 16 seconds. If it went longer than that, it's like a Zoom call after 20 minutes, it just shuts off. So we had to edit all of these things. And that's kind of what we did. We started putting Vortex out on YouTube in 2008. And in 2009, or I'm sorry, no, it wasn't quite that early. Anyway, whenever YouTube became available, we started putting Vortex on it. And that's kind of how it gained, traction. And then about 10 years later or so, roughly, a lot of other Catholic media type either outfits or people kind of started doing something of the same thing. And now there's this sort of glut of Catholic talking heads out on social media, on camera, like there is in the secular world as well. So
Yeah.
it's a big train wreck now.
You recently had a program on that. I don't know which, but it's called Wacky Catholic Conjecture, Catholic Fake News.
Right.
Where you talked incidents where the Catholic media out there runs to get a story and they don't corroborate it, and they come up with all kinds of false conclusions.
Yeah.
Like what was the headline? Cardinal Pell was murdered. George Newmar was murdered. Joe Biden put a Baphomet in the White House, and UFOs are going to end the world for us.
The assertion was that Jill Biden had put a Baphomet likeness in the White House. And so here's the problem with this stuff, Robert. I mean, look, there's one thing to go out and just say, like, crazy, wacky stuff. And you can certainly even report on the crazy, wacky stuff as long as it's clear to the viewer that you are reporting on it as crazy, wacky stuff. But, your credibility, the accuracy of your reporting or your commentary, since there doesn't seem to be that much of a difference anymore in the media world between actual reporting, just the raw data points, and commenting on them, your entire credibility depends on the accuracy of what it is you're saying. That's it. Why should anybody listen to you if what you're saying can't be trusted? Because it's wrong, or it's clickbaity, or it's headline grabbing, or whatever. Much of the secular media world operates like that, although you couldn't necessarily say what they're saying is, what they're reporting is untrue as the report itself, but to just sit out there and kind of propagate something they know isn't true, like Adam Schiff with the Russia, Steele dossier. They knew that wasn't true.
It's how much you can get away with these days.
Yeah. Catholic media, I'll put quotes around Catholic and around media, because they're both questionable. If you're going to, purport yourself to be bringing Catholic information, which is aimed at the salvation of souls, first, middle, and last, if you're going to be saying that, I'm Catholic, listen to me, this is for the good of your soul, and then you're going to be saying things that you either haven't researched, you haven't properly vetted, you haven't chased down, they are either not true, or they're certainly not true in their entirety. And I'm sorry, that just doesn't pass the smell test for saying you're Catholic, and it certainly doesn't pass the smell test either for saying you're in the world of journalism. I know the world of journalism has been shot to hell over the last, 20, 30 years, at least the perception of it, the desire to get it right for the good of the listener hasn't been the case in journalism for decades, but it's all come to light and was really sort of pushed off the cliff by Donald Trump. So people began to wake up and understand, everything we're being told is a lie, or so much of it is either a lie or deception. But in the Catholic media world, you don't get to do that. I mean, I expect that when I'm reading something in the New York Times, their facts might be right, but how they arrange the facts and then who they go and interview to give a spin on those facts, immediately your eyebrows go up and go, here we go. But, it's worth reading just to sort of know what a set of facts are. But, no story, including what we do here, has all of the facts in it. It's impossible. You just can't do it.
Yeah.
So, the question is,
I remember you saying on one of your shows just recently where you had a story, it's a big story, but you couldn't verify, you couldn't corroborate it, and so you didn't run with it. And
Correct.
did you ever find that corroboration and run with it or not?
I believe we did now. Yeah. I don't want to say which story that is. I'm pretty sure I just don't want to tip off. I don't want to say something that gets out there, which could then be redirected back at somebody.
Sure.
And this is another thing in the Catholic world as well, that so much of the information that comes our way here at Church Militant is provided to us by sources inside the church who either don't agree with how things are being done because it's a detriment to souls, because it's a detriment to the church teaching or the truth or whatever. And they are very few in number in a given chancery or university or seminary or whatever the case might be, parish. So,
and they have nowhere to go. They have nowhere else to go.
That's exactly right. They know us, and they come to us with this stuff. And so sometimes.
So you're like a magnet. You're like a magnet for these people.
Yeah. I mean, yes, like everything that has its pros and its cons.
Oh, Michael, you don't have to be self-deprecating anymore. Okay. Enough of that. All right.
No, it's true. It's true. The con isn't normally the information. I mean, we do occasionally get some kind of, I don't know, UFO type story, but most of the stuff that comes to us is very valid and, at least valid from the perception of the person who's calling us and telling us. Some of it's not verifiable. Doesn't mean the person's lying. It's just, you have a different burden of proof. You have a different standard before you go out in public and say, this is a fact.
Because I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are waiting for you guys to mess up on a story that you say was true that isn't true, and there it goes your credibility. You're done.
And good luck with that. Waiting. And the reason I say that, and that's not to be cocky, I mean, it's like journalism humor, but everybody who works here will tell you that one of the things, for viewers who may not know, your viewers, Robert, who may not know, my background was in secular news. I mean, I went from a communications degree at Notre Dame in 1983 straight to CBS in New York, stayed there for about a year, worked on a number of different shows, Bill Curtis and Diane Sawyer, morning news, that's how far back I go, Charles Osgood, weekend news. Some of the older viewers will remember those names. I remember them. Yeah, I remember all these people.
Charles Osgood, my gosh.
Charles Osgood, a very nice man. Charles Carrault, worked with him a couple of times on stuff.
Remember him.
Dan Rather, I worked on the evening news 2 years after Cronkite had retired and all that. So, I as far as the tools of the business, I'm not talking about the philosophy or the ideology, which was liberal back then there. I'm talking about as far as the tools of the business, I was taught by the best people in the industry. All of Walter Cronkite's crew, again, he was as liberal as can be. I'm talking about the chasing down of the story, the mechanism, the mechanics of the business. I learned from the best people in the business. And so and I carried that into my secular career. I was in secular news for, I don't know, whatever, 18 years, 19 years, whatever it was. I forget now exactly, but somewhere in that neighborhood. And so when we began the apostolate in 2006, it was strictly, catechesis and apologetics. That's all it was for the first roughly 3 years. But then when Obama went to Notre Dame in 2009, and I was like, how is this possible? How can that man, the child killer in chief, be standing on a stage and not just give a commencement address, but then have the university drape the honors of Our Lady's School over this child killer? How could this come to be the case? And so my journalism hat, my reporter hat went back on, and I started asking questions. And that was sort of a sea change moment for us here, a watershed moment, where he said, okay, hold on a second. There's something seriously wrong in the church. So in addition to constantly talking about the teachings of the church and the apologetics and scripture and the saints and all of that, we also began talking about the crisis in the church. And I went to some of the most intelligent, educated, longtime warriors in those battles, like Dr. Charlie Rice at Notre Dame, God rest his soul. Got in touch with the Wanderer folks who'd been documenting this forever, the Joe Matt family, as opposed to the Remnant. This is the Wanderer, the original paper going back to the time of the U.S. Civil War, and went and talked to these people, read their material, the whole bit, and became enlightened. I mean, I wasn't born with this knowledge, just like nobody is. Everybody learns as you move through life, and when we began reporting on things here and began being as much of a media news information outlet added on to our original work, which we still do, of supporting the faith and teaching the faith and all of that, one of the things I was very insistent on, and everybody here on staff will tell you, I could, if I wanted to right now, I'm sitting on our set, but I'm in the media pit. If I were to yell out off the stage and say, hey guys, what are the questions you should ask of every story, the entire staff out there would yell back, who, what, where, when, why, how much, and to what extent. That's what you have to answer, those questions for every single story that you're going to chase down. What is the story? Who's involved? Where did it happen? When did it happen? Why? Make a timeline, line it up. Much of journalism, and it's probably one of the reasons that as a journalist, I always got along with prosecutors and defense attorneys and law enforcement so much. It's just part of the job. You always got to, you chase a story down like they all chase down a murder, a homicide, or a robbery, or white collar theft, or whatever it is. We just don't have subpoena power in the media, and we're also not allowed to carry around guns and tell people with their hands up against the wall. Although sometimes you would like to be able to do that, but you use all the tools at your disposal that you have, and you put the narrative together. And then, if to the degree that you can check it and double check it, that's what journalism and reporting is.
Yeah.
Very, very few outfits in the Catholic media world do that.
Yeah.
No matter what it looks like, no matter how much it kind of is portrayed that way. Many of the stories that I see on other Catholic places, we know those stories as well. And I look at them and say, they've left out that. I don't know if they didn't know it, they didn't vet it enough to find it out, or they deliberately left it out. That's not my decision to make. I just know that piece of information is missing. It's missing from that report. It's not talked about in the commentary section. Well, why is that? And I don't mean the comments. I mean the commentary provided on many of these just talking head shows, where it's clear if you listen to them long enough and the material, you're like, these guys aren't talking. What they're saying isn't accurate. Or let me erase that. What they're saying isn't sufficient to be able to speak about the story intelligently. The data points may be right, but how they've arranged them, how they're presenting them to the viewers is not accurate. The viewer does not walk away more fully informed about whatever it is that's being spoken about, whether it's UFOs flying around in the sky is hinted at in the book of Revelation and means the end of the world, or, there's various apparitions that have not been approved. One of the things, I was talking to somebody here earlier today and said, even if you go after, if you're doing some sort of report on an approved apparition, private revelation, that oftentimes you run into these weird anomalies. It's not to deny the apparition, of course not. The church has approved it. But once that apparition now sort of moves out into the world, now it gets a different spin. And, in the age of the internet, a spin that is more sensational might take the lead position and people begin to believe this thing that doesn't have any truth at all. It's like a Catholic urban myth about an approved apparition. And then a storyline develops about the urban myth, which has no basis in reality whatsoever.
Yeah.
And to just sort of get on the air and start babbling about stuff, which upsets people of weak faith. It raises doubts in their mind because they say something that doesn't seem to make much sense. And then they attribute it to a saint, or since the church approved this apparition, everything I'm saying over here about the apparition, therefore, is true. No, it's not.
Yeah.
And there's these kind of distinctions, because the Catholic mind makes distinctions. You have to make distinctions. And to either deceive, which ascribes a bad motive to the wrong chatter, or to just not know it well enough but you still feel free to go on and just say whatever comes into your mind about it. That's not fair. It's not just. It's inaccurate, and you have the ability to damage souls because of it. To weaken their faith, to drive them out of the church, to make them lose their faith. Did a story a couple days ago on a priest who a priest was listening to one particular website or commentator in the Catholic world, and the constant going on about the confusion and stuff around the Pope Francis papacy caused a priest to lose his faith in the priesthood and leave.
I saw that. Yeah.
What? And you think that's okay to present a view of the Pope that is so distorted? And I'm not saying, we've reported on tons of things, and for the record, twice I've gone on air and said Pope Francis should resign. So it's not like I'm being some cheerleader for the confusion.
Yeah. But what this guy was doing was telling this priest, here's the solution.
Well, that's how the priest interpreted it. So you have to be very careful when you're sitting in front of a camera and people recognize you. You do, for a living might not be the right way to describe it, but nonetheless, it's part of your professional duties and responsibilities. You present yourself to the public as an authority on the things you talk about. We do the same thing here, that when we get up and read a news story, for example, on evening news, we have the integrity to be able to say, yep, this is what happened. Here's the who, what, where, when, why, how much, and to what extent, that we have done our best to be able to lock down and secure as being accurate. When I do a vortex, the exact same thing. Your standard of proof must be the truth. That's the standard you're hitting. And to just say things recklessly in such a way that you are unaware or don't care, or I don't know, just aren't thinking that what you're saying is being consumed by people who are not all on the same, same place on their spiritual journey spectrum. They're not all in the same place. Some people just coming into the church or just beginning to sort of rub up against the faith, can't hear things like, the Pope's not really the Pope. Maybe somebody who's very well advanced in their faith life and everything can just say, oh, that's just stupid, and move on. But people who are there, people who are weak in their faith, or they're having a bad moment in their life, or I don't know, their best friend just left the faith and they're kind of shaken by it, and then they happen to click on some website or some talking head who says, the Pope isn't really the Pope. This shatters some people's faith. Yeah. Not everybody is able to hear this sort of thing. And it's not true. And to suggest that it's true, or to put up polls to just ask people's opinion about, why don't you put up a poll asking Catholics' opinions if Jesus is really divine? As opposed to, is Pope Francis really the Pope? Or
I think what's even more what's even more insidious on this line that you're working on here is those that try to play both sides of the fence. You're dealing a lot with the SSPX now.
Right.
And so it's not, we still believe he's the Pope, but we have these excuses over here and these little areas we can go into. That's probably harder to deal with, isn't it? Than a strict sedevacantist who is out to lunch. But now you have to deal with, we're still with the Pope, but
Yeah, we've got his picture up on the wall. We say his name in Mass, so therefore we're loyal sons of the church. Well, I don't think the bar that you have to step over to be considered a loyal son of the church stops at whether you actually recognize Francis as the Pope or not. I think the bar is a little higher than that.
Well, this is what I appreciate about your whole ministry is there's a very fine line you have to walk
Yes,
between
absolutely.
criticizing Pope Francis that he obviously needs criticizing for.
And he has invited that criticism and welcomed that criticism. He did it last week in that Associated Press article.
Yeah. So, I mean, I got to congratulate you guys, all of you, not just you, Christine, all the reporters there. I'm getting to know them like my best friends because I see them every day. Who's that guy, Dr. somebody? Sort of, he's an older guy, sort of heavy set. I forget his name. I mean, I'm sorry to describe him that way, but I'm trying to get a picture in your mind.
Robert, you just gave me some ammo that when we're done here, so the older guy, a doctor, heavy set, that would be Dr. William Mahoney.
Is that who it is, Mahoney? Okay. Sorry. Tell William I'm very sorry.
Yeah, he's going to hate you because you've given me ammo now to give him grief.
Yeah.
He's he along with some other people here, but since you specifically singled him out, one of the most intelligent men you'll ever run across.
Yeah.
Well versed, steeped in the faith and the knowledge of the faith and the history of the faith, and his own personal experience of things that went on. We have a number of people here on staff like that. I will say, and it's not bragging, although I might say it in a bragging fashion, you will not find a collection of smarter, more well-informed, well-educated, experienced Catholics anywhere in the Catholic media world, and that probably would extend, I would say, to some universities and things as well, like you will find here at Church Militant.
Well, that's why I say you're like a magnet. You attract those people, and when they come, they're dedicated.
Absolutely.
They don't come to sit around and just get a paycheck. By the way, how many hours a week do you work?
I'm not answering that question.
You're not answering that question. Okay. Well, you look like you get some good sleep at night. I mean, you look good. So,
it's a lot. I guess one of the reasons is, I mean, what are the hours I clock in? It's officially 40, which everybody here officially clocks in 40 hours roughly. But the when you're doing a job that, I mean, the news doesn't stop at 5 o'clock. And the information going on. And so there's always this kind of, look, every major profession, law, medicine, law enforcement, all of these things, there's always these kind of continuing education classes that are mandatory for you to go to. Every major profession has that. Some of them turn the once or twice a year conferences into these big boondoggles in Vegas or San Diego or whatever. I wish somebody would do that in the media world so we could do it. But there's no kind of continuing education in that sense, like a formal conference you go to in the media world. But there is the constant updating of information, and you get on the phone and you're talking to somebody. It doesn't matter if it's the weekend, or it doesn't matter if the call goes on for 2 or 3 hours on a given evening while you're home. I mean, are you working? Not officially on the clock, but you're still putting in the hours learning something, because what are we doing? We're exploring the truth, and if you talk to really good attorneys, their lives are like this as well.
That's why they're all nuts.
It's not really a 9 to 5 thing. And there's a certain personality type that excels in the world of gathering information, and there are certain personality types that don't excel in that. And it's not a right or wrong. It's just who's a good fit. Somebody's not sinful if they're not going to spend 20 hours a week outside of work learning more about the information they're reporting on. It's certainly not a sin or immoral or unethical or anything of the sort, but it's not a good fit. It's just not, because that's just the nature of this arena. If you step into this arena, you have to have a thirst for knowing what's going on and who to talk to and who to understand a story better. Who can you talk to who will give you a greater understanding and share their expertise in this matter or that matter with you. And that simply cannot be done in a 9-to-5 block. It just can't be done.
Yeah.
So again,
besides William Mahoney, who I think is one of your top-notch theological, biblical, ecclesiastical, he's got it all. You can just tell he's got it all. And he's
Dr. William Mahoney or Bill, short obviously, or we just call him B, letter B.
Yeah.
So he's great.
Brad, I know whatever comes out of William's mouth is going to be good. I know that just by watching him. And then Christine Niles. I don't know who she works with, but man, you guys put together one of the best documentaries. I'm talking about with all the bells and whistles. You know what I'm talking about. Who do you have working for you that does all that? And then you get this, nice girl, Christine, coming along and just speaking her piece, but she's surrounded by all these good graphics, sound. You pick the best videos, the landscape and everything. I mean, you got some good people there.
That the all of the production quality of that you're talking about, not necessarily the direct content, which Christine is responsible for and writes about and chases down and vets and talks to victims and experts and all of that and puts together the script. Once the script is done, it gets handed over to a fellow by the name of Andy Vance. And Andy is the one responsible for all of that you're talking about as far as the look of the reports and the sound effects and the graphics and all of that. And he does a fantastic job with that. Absolutely tremendous. He's been with us doing it now. I believe it's a couple of years, I think. He came to us during the whole COVID thing because he'd lost his earlier, as most of the country did, lost their either their livelihoods or the regular work that they would do and that sort of thing. And then he came here because there's a relative of his who works here, has been here for a very long time. And so we just started talking about things, and he jumped in feet first, and he produces he edits and shoots and puts together those graphics and all those presentations that are, absolutely top notch.
Absolutely. I know what to look for because, we were on your show almost 10 years ago, and we made our theatrical movie. So I know what goes in to doing this. It's a lot.
Depending on the the particular investigative report that may be being done, it could take as much as 2 to 4 weeks to make it look like. Yeah,
that's a long time. Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty involved. It's
the last one I saw that I said these guys turned the corner because the graphics are so good, the music's good, the timing's good. Was when what was his name? Father Minsk or Minsky's or something like that. He got murdered. What was his name?
Father Minkler.
Minkler. And I'm looking at this and I'm going, wow, what a production. So well, that explains it. If it takes 2 to 4 weeks to put that together, I can see why. So that's good. Yes. So let me run down some of the other.
I will be not good in my duties here if I wouldn't also call out Brad Eli. A bunch of alphabet letters after his name. One of the really smart experiences with the Franciscans for a number, not as a priest, in the community for 20 years, 22 years. Rodney Pelletier was with him for roughly half of that time. He's here also. These guys have gone through the mill of the church corruption and the double speak and the this and that and everything. They're both now happily married and fathers here. And
so let me ask you, Mike, are any of those guys old and heavy set?
You've already got me in trouble with William. I'm not gonna say anything about.
Well, I figured you could sort of, you could say, William, I don't know who he's talking about. Could have been one of these other two guys. Who knows?
I know. I'm gonna. Yeah, you give. I just best if I just avoid no comment.
Well, I'm sure you're used to that. Huh? Okay, so some of the other.
but this is one of them.
Okay. Some of the other programs you got, Evening News, The Daily Beat, News Reports, Investigate. I'm just getting this off your website.
Yeah.
Marian Movement, Mic'd Up. Now,
Yep.
that's an old program. So what's
That's
different than Mic'd Up than the Vortex, let's say?
Mic'd Up is for your viewers who, again, who are older, might remember the style of the old Nightline show that was hosted by Ted Koppel.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Where they would do roughly a 20 or 30-minute show. It began because of the Iranian hostage crisis.
The one where Ted never moved his neck, you ever,
Correct. Yes, he would just spin around in the chair and talk to the screen, which, by the way, wasn't there. Lots of people don't realize that, but there was no screen there.
No kidding. Okay.
Yeah, there was nothing. It was like the weatherman standing in front of a green wall, and you think there's a map there. There was nothing behind on that screen when Ted Koppel used to do the interviews. But yeah, we sort of styled it after that to take one topic and do something of an in-depth on it. It's not an investigation in that sense where we're kind of exposing something, but it's more the treating of something. So we do a longer, what we call a package, which is a video report. It has the name in the industry of a package. We do a package on whatever the topic is and do some interviews in that and explain it and just put all that together. And then when that's over, we'll do an extended interview with an expert in the topic of the show that we had done the package on. And that was pretty much it was a pretty simple formula, actually, on Nightline. Once the Iranian hostages were freed at 444 days, the day Reagan was sworn in as president, January 20th, then the show was like, oh, what do we do here? Because Nightline began kind of as an accident. Nobody was thinking in terms of, hey, this is just going to go on for years. They just had this show to just kind of report on, hey, the hostages have been taken, and here's kind of where this stands today. And day 1 turned into day 18, they turned into day 193, turned into day 444, and they were finally released. And after that time, ABC, which ran that show, ABC News, said, hey, everybody seems to like this, so let's now just massage it a little bit and turn it into this. And then it went on, and it's still on. It'd be one of the most viewed programs in
So you're
television.
saying they just took one story and really delved into it. Okay.
Correct.
I'm glad you reminded me of that, because I didn't realize that was Nightline's sort of theme, but now that it makes sense now that you say it. So, and you got Saint of the Day, headlines, reclaiming tradition, and Red Top Report. What's Red Top Report?
Red Top Report is an effort largely from our Church Militant Resistance team, where Joe Enders, who is one of our younger reporters here, will take a topic and treat of it in a way that's a little bit more oriented towards younger crowds that have a little bit more, how would you say it, chutzpah, and sometimes humor and that sort of thing. So he's got good insights on many of the things that that come up in the social media world and the popular culture / political arena, and that sort of thing. So that's our foray into that arena of saying largely, you can say a little bit more, well, I don't know if you can say more, but you can say things differently to a group of 20-somethings and early 30-somethings than you can to people who are, maybe in their 50s or 60s, who sort of don't get that humor. It's just not their thing. So
that's who I feel sorry for, is our group of brothers who are 20, 30 years old, who have to go through all this crap. You and I have been through it. We're used to it by now. We're just waiting for the next story to come out, that shows us, it's all real. But they're just getting into it, and
it's one of the things.
That's why I like your approach, where you're trying to say, look, stay with the church, with the church. He's the Pope. Okay, you have nowhere else to go, but don't give them a license to do any of this stuff without standing up against it. And that's a beautiful place to be, Mike. Beautiful place.
It really is. It's if I'm talking to some of these guys, some of the younger guys here, and we have a fair number of them, sometimes I'll just think to myself, my goodness, I mean, you and I are of a certain age and generation, and many of our viewers are and stuff, who recognize that there has been this tremendous sea change, so much so that the country bears almost and the church bears almost no resemblance to what it was when we were growing up. We remember when, I had my, some of my mom's family, even though the family is Irish, they're living in England. And years ago, when I was working at CBS in the early 80s, some of them came over to visit. And my aunt, from England, Irish, but living in England, said to me, she's like, Michael, I'm stunned. Everywhere I look, I just see American flags. And it never occurred to me that, yeah, Americans are sort of patriotic in our DNA. Today, and that was back in the early 80s. So in our living memory, there was a time where you proudly flew the flag and you stood up and you said the Pledge of Allegiance, and nobody would think anything about that. I remember a time when I was a kid going to the movies, where the very first thing that would happen is they would play the national anthem in the theater and show you the American flag on, the beginning of the movie clip. Are you kidding me? They do that now. They'd be, protested for racism and, the CRT and everything else. And
well, now we have the rainbow flag.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. I have a really, a sense of feeling really bad for many of the younger folks, obviously here, because I'm in contact with them frequently. But, you don't really know how to say, you just don't know what it used to be like.
Yeah.
You've grown up in this time. 2015 now, was the Obergefell decision for, gay marriage, or whatever you want to call it. I don't even know what to call it. Roe. I remember, I've lived long enough to remember Roe being handed down by the Supreme Court. And I shared on a show a couple of weeks ago or something on the anniversary. I remember hearing the word abortion for the first time when I was 11. And I turned to my mother. I was 11 years old, and nobody had ever talked about this, at least in some sort of public sense of, where it was a big driving issue. And I turned to my mom when I was 11 and said, "What's abortion, Mommy?" And she's like, "Oh, that's when they go inside the mother's tummy and kill the baby." I'm like, "What?" And, at 11, you're like, and there was a time where I know all of this stuff was operating behind the scenes. I know that. I get that, obviously. But it had not penetrated onto the stage. It was all, off in the wings and back behind the scrims on the stage. It was all being done, but you didn't see it and you didn't hear about it. Of course, the goal of these people, the Marxists, was to bring all this stuff forward in the church, in the culture, and everything else. Well, these guys growing up now who are essentially under 40, maybe 35, or to just sort of put a ballpark on it, they've never known America where it was the way it used to be. All they've ever seen and known of America is this kind of socialist-oriented facsimile of it. And, it's very sad. If you're older, you look almost with a certain askance or pity on younger people who just don't know what this used to be like.
Yeah.
I remember the bicentennial, on July 4th, 1976, and all the tall ships sailing into New York Harbor. I was 15 or just about to turn 15. It's my freshman year in high school. And all the tall ships sailing in and all the firework displays and the nonstop media coverage, and everybody was just rah American and the whole bit. I mean, when Top Gun got released, the original Top Gun, it was like, yeah, and there was all of this like American, the whole thing. And there was a sense of that even in the church, of like how proud you were to be a Catholic and all this, even as the kind of unwinding of all of this was going on, where the unraveling of all of it was beginning. There was still a sense of I'm Catholic and this, and all of this stuff. And for many older Catholics who are also American patriots, even though there's problems with America, I'm not equating the church and Catholicism. One's from God, one's from man, but nonetheless, there's a parallel you can draw between the two. And if you were, I grew up in the military. My dad was in the Air Force. I mean, I always had great respect and, love and admiration for U.S. military, even when the whole Vietnam stuff was going on and soldiers are coming back and getting spit on and having stuff thrown at them and all of that. This is a different country than it was 35 years ago.
Yeah.
It is a different country. There was an argument in the House Judiciary Committee yesterday or the day before between Matthew Gaetz and Jerry Nadler, because Matthew Gaetz wanted to say the Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of each Judiciary Committee hearing, and Jerry Nadler objected to it and said, well, why are we doing this? To look more patriotic? Well, yeah, sure, nothing wrong with that. You got 20 seconds to say the pledge there, Jerry, as opposed to trumping up fake impeachment charges. So you could not imagine, when I was 25, that these kinds of conversations would even be going on.
Yeah.
That,
I'm going to switch gears with you.
Running drag shows and all of this stuff. It's not the same country. We are in a transition. What we're transitioning to, that's a good question.
Yeah.
And that many Catholics in the church, although the church is not in transition because it can't be. Jesus Christ is the church and he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. But individuals in the church are in a transition. And those people have to have this explained to them, even if it costs you personally, which it does, this. So what? Doesn't matter. You don't live forever here on earth. So, you just put up with whatever the garbage is they hurl at you, and you just say what you got to say. And
you just do your job. That's all you can do. You go out there and you keep preaching the same message.
People will listen to you. This is one of the things we like to impress on viewers and stuff when they say, so what can I do? I say, well, look, stand up and say Saint Bernadette said, my duty isn't to convert you. My duty is to inform you. And when you inform, some people will respond to that information, and they will amend their lives or start to, or strengthen their lives or, get better or, whatever the case is. The fact that some people don't, okay, not your wheelhouse.
Well, let me switch gears with you here because I want your sort of philosophical analysis on the patterns that we see that you just described. Because if you look at any society in the past, who was the guy that wrote that whole history of societies? Oh gosh,
Will and Ariel Durant, A History of Civilization.
No, it's not him. It's another guy. He wrote 19 volumes basically, and all the societies. He goes way back. Okay, we're talking about thousands BC. All the societies went through the same trajectory. They went up and then they went down, and when they went down, one of the greatest signs of that was the homosexuality. Okay. Mm-hmm. Every society that he looked at, the end product was homosexuality, unbridled, institutionalized homosexuality.
Yep.
Which is, you go through all of, you see the same pattern over and over again. Okay. So that's where we are now. And it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, if it gets better.
If it gets better. Yeah. That's, I always put an asterisk next to that statement.
Yeah.
That old adage, because there's a presumption there that it will get better. It might not get better.
Yeah. Well, you go back in the Old Testament and you read the history of Israel, you saw the same thing. They would go up the trajectory, down, and God comes in and judges, and then they have to start all over again.
Right.
And went on for hundreds of years like that.
Yep.
Until finally, 2 times he said, I've had it. Kaput, it's over. You're going into captivity. Then we'll start over again 70 years later, and on and on that went. We're the same way. We're exactly the same way. Man doesn't change, because the grace is there, but the question is, are we going to use it? Okay.
Right.
So what I want to get from you is, you often talk about the Griswold case. I thought it was 63. You say 65. Is that correct?
I believe Griswold was 65. Yeah.
65,
the Supreme Court case legalizing contraception for use between married couples.
Yeah. So then 10 years later or 8 years later, we get the abortion from the Supreme Court, and you could see the line is going to follow itself, and that's going to be the end result. You let contraception go, you're going to have abortion. Now, with the homosexuality issue is what I'm always intrigued about this, because my question is, what is the attraction with homosexuality. If observe, let me just finish here and then you can go on. If you look at what these guys actually do in the nitty gritty, it's like a dog going to eat his vomit. And when you look at that, it's like the most disgusting thing, So it's like, what is it that's attracting these guys? We saw that with abortion, you could see the contraception issue eventually led to abortion. What led to homosexuality? What is it that is so insidious about this lifestyle that it just keeps on going and exploding into the society? What is it from your
I,
point?
I would say, sort of philosophically, it's not a development of the contraceptive mentality. I would say it is a consequence of it, because the two really don't have to do with each other. I mean, why would two gay guys or two lesbians need to practice contraception? Duh.
Yeah.
But the philosophical flow of it is, once you say approving contraception, you have stated that the sexual act between a man and a woman is no longer directly related to life. It simply becomes a sexual act. If you want to try to get pregnant, okay. If you don't, that's okay too. Once you've established that foundation and you've moved away from the chief reason for the sexual act is procreation. Once you destroy that underpinning and you move the ground over to this, now once you've said it's legal, which is what the Supreme Court did first in Griswold between just married couples, and then later on in the Eisenstadt case, 3 or 4 years later, shifted and said, well, if married couples can use contraception, so can just regular people who aren't married. So once you can begin to see the snowball effect there. So if a heterosexual married couple can engage in sex and not use the action or the activity to procreate, to bring another life into being, and that philosophy is now legally enshrined in the culture and protected by law, well, now it turns into, well, hey, why can't I have sex? With, as the guy in Canada, his dog. Why can't I marry my dog? Why can't I have sex with anything? Once you decouple these two, that's what you get to.
Yeah, I'm wondering how deep that goes, because like you think of Sodom and Gomorrah. Did they really have a contraception problem? Well, I don't know. Okay. So it's like
maybe a few houses in the neighborhood did, but I'm pretty sure most of them didn't.
It's like homosexuality.
Robert, if I can say this, because I know we're somewhat short on time, but
okay.
I think the reason you see so much of this now is not because of that. I think that becomes the excuse to engage in the sexual act. But why would there be an increased attraction to this? Well, because what happens when you introduce the idea of contraception into a culture, not just that specific area of you give permission to have sex with whoever you want, but you begin to shatter the family and shatter the home. You give license to people to now cheat. You certainly do. And when the home and the family get destroyed and there's all kinds of problems, and then all of a sudden fathers aren't present, but there are already children left over from when there was something of a marriage in place. Once that begins to happen, you start to shatter the family ideal. Not that everybody lived an ideal family. That's not what I mean. But there is a certain model that you should be following. Every child has a right to a mother and a father that loves and cares for them and is willing to sacrifice to protect them and make them safe. And then they grow up and become adults, and the cycle repeats. If that cycle gets interrupted, and the boy or girl, but specifically boys, all of a sudden has a sense that his father doesn't care for him, or his father doesn't protect him, or his father's just sort of there, but not really. We all know how like little children are like sponges. They're like a little emotional sponges. They observe something and then they process it, not really so much with an intellect, but their base instincts, their young child instincts of I'm not safe, I'm not protected. And they translate that into I'm not loved. I might be provided for kind of on one level or another, like I get food, or there's a roof over my head or something, but
they can sense it.
Yeah, they sense something's off here, and the effect on them, because that's the only place they have to reason at a young age, is that they just aren't safe. They're not protected.
I'm just wondering if there's another dimension to this, because as I said, I find it hard to see what's attractive. I can see someone practicing contraception because they don't want to be responsible for children and all that psychology. But the homosexual thing, to me, it's almost like they went to another level, and I'm just going to use the term. It's almost like the devil got into them, like they're possessed, and they can't even help what they're doing. They're just looking for the next adventure because the devil's there, and he's like, working in them, and they go and do something they don't even want to do because the devil's in there. Do you see that dimension in there for the proliferation?
Certainly from a spiritual standpoint, sure. But what's the natural, not supernatural, but what's the driving natural force there? Is that they're looking for their father.
Looking for their father. Wow.
They're looking for their father. They're looking for, and they don't necessarily think about it in those terms. Like walk around, I'm going to go look for my father. Yeah. But the psychology.
Well, and that makes a connection to the contraception, because as soon as the father says, I don't have to be responsible for children, well, then he's not responsible for his family. It just extends itself. And then he just basically plays around.
Kids growing up today who are the children of, well, I didn't even want to say divorce, because tons of people don't even get married anymore. But they're the man, and especially for sons, the man who is supposed to pass on manhood in all of its glory and gore is not there. So it never happens.
Gotcha.
So they never receive that, because God has put that into them as part of the constituent nature of being a male. It's missing. They know it's missing, so they go looking for it. So it's the old daddy wound or whatever, but it's something far deeper than that. It's not just, it's they're looking to have what they were deprived of from their earliest memories.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Mike, we got time for one more question, because it looks like we got 3 minutes. Okay. And this was sent in. I told you about it yesterday, but I promised him I would say it. So, he's talking about the TLM, the traditional Latin Mass, versus the Novus Ordo. I'm not sure exactly what he's asking here, but I guess he wants to know from your perspective, how do you interpret all this confusion between the two? Where do you go? Where do you suggest people go? Do you think the Novus Ordo is okay to go to? I mean, all that. Can you just give us in 3 minutes what you think?
Sure. Yeah, I'll do my best on that. Just personally, I go to both. Oftentimes, we do a lot of traveling, so I'm oftentimes on the road, and if I'm being hosted, wherever our hosts go is where we go. Sometimes that's a TLM, sometimes it's a Reverent Novus Ordo. Occasionally, it's a bad, bad in terms of reverence. Novus Ordo.
Do you really find that many of those, Mike, though? I mean, an irreverent Novus Ordo. Do you really find that many of them?
Oh, yeah. I don't attend them.
Okay.
If I have a choice, I don't attend them, and I understand people's revulsion at attending them, because it becomes just the whole show, the theater of it becomes a great distraction. But, I mean, you can't just get up and, well, I suppose if there's heresy being preached, you can get up and leave. But, you have a Sunday obligation and you need to go to Mass. And sometimes, depending on your individual life and circumstances, you might find yourself at one of these and, just pray. Jesus is still there on the altar. He's still called down from heaven at the Eucharistic prayer as long as the priest has the form and matter and intent. He's still there in the tabernacle, even though he's abused and disrespected and everything else. So, your presence there can provide him a little comfort. But yeah, the Novus Ordo Mass is not evil, as the SSPX maintains. It is not invalid, as the Sedevacantists maintain. I'd say, if I just sort of had to take a wild guess here, in the studio, there's roughly 60 people here. I'd say about half go to the TLM and about half go to Reverent Novus Ordo Masses. Sometimes that switches week to week depending on what people's lives are, what's happening in their lives. But it's a source of great confusion and pain for many Catholics. But just because somebody offers the traditional Latin Mass, that a priest, doesn't mean that priest is holy. There's not a necessary connection between the two, and just because the Second Vatican Council wanted to update the liturgy with some reforms here or there, does not therefore make the Second Vatican Council heretical, because what came out of the blueprint for the change turned into something a lot more, what we just laughingly refer to as clown masses. That's not what Vatican II called for at all. It said largely keep the Latin, the organ has, primary place, all of these things. A Reverent Novus Ordo Mass looks largely like what the Council Fathers had intended. But that, unfortunately, because of modernism in the church and malformed bishops and clergy and everything else, that is not what was largely followed. What was largely come out of this, not out of the council, but out of the organizing committee for the new Mass, was what you see largely of, people showing up in flip-flops and, communion in the hand and standing up and singing Amazing Grace, which is a heretical Protestant song, and all of these things. The Second Vatican Council called for none of that. Yeah. And it is a great disrespect to foist upon viewers and readers and followers that somehow the Second Vatican Council called for all of this or was responsible for all this. It did not do that. Every single one of those council fathers was a bishop who was ordained and consecrated, ordained a priest and consecrated a bishop in the old rite. So, you can't just say, oh, these guys just walked away. That's not what they did. Some of the people after them, 10-ish years later, 8 years later, did put together a formula where a lot of abuse of the Mass could enter in. But the Second Vatican Council itself did not call for that. Matter of fact, it called for much of the opposite. So is a Novus Ordo Mass a valid Mass? Absolutely. Is it a licit Mass? Absolutely. Is it subject to abuse? Yes. And the priest and the bishop who allows that, his bishop who allows that, will have to answer to Almighty God for that. But it doesn't make it invalid just because he's saying crazy stuff, or the music is horrible, or they're singing Protestant hymns, or, my goodness, when I was in a folk group back in the mid-'70s, I had to announce, as a member of the folk group, standing up on the steps of the sanctuary, because that's what we had, I'm strumming my guitar, and said, please stand for our opening hymn, One Tin Soldier, from the Ode to Billy Joe, whatever, I can't remember the name of the movie. Older people remember that, because the word heaven was in it, so therefore it was a hymn. It wasn't a hymn. Many of us who are older lived through all of that crap. We get it. I don't know if I can say crap on the air or not, but anyway, there it is. That's rare. That doesn't mean the Second Vatican Council is heretical. It doesn't mean the church lost her position as being the church. It doesn't mean the Pope isn't the Pope. It means you need to stay in the church and fight against these things, as much as you possibly can. And
that's why
it does not answer that question.
I'm with you on every point, Mike. Every single point you made, I am right with you there. What the Vatican Council II did and what came out of it with the liberals in charge, there's 90% of our Catholic Church are liberals, and
Yeah.
they did damage to Vatican II, and they are still doing it today.
Well,
So
if it's
I'm
only
right
90%, I'm glad the number has improved. That's because I thought it used to be, closer to like 98. So good.
it
Heading
could
in the
be.
right direction.
Anyway, thank you so much for all of that. I agree with every point you made. We're like long lost brothers as far as that's concerned. So, my goodness. So, thank you for coming on. And I hope I can tear you away from your 40-hour work week some other time and we can get together and talk about some other things. Would you like to do
Absolutely.
that for us? Would
Would
you?
love to. Absolutely.
Okay. So
It's
maybe
good
like
to hear these kind of expanded conversations of, of things. It's very good.
yeah. And we need each other because we're outnumbered, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
So maybe once every 3 months, 6 months, who knows? But I'll give you another call and see when you're available. But thanks for
Absolutely.
coming on.
Thank you very much, Robert. And God
All
bless
right.
all your viewers and listeners.
Okay. You take care.
All
Bye-bye.
righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.